Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 58 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Los Angeles Kings, in which the Sharks have won 5-0. So a strong win, which is something that we really haven't seen from the San Jose Sharks as of late. The last time there was a statement victory that they had was back near the end of January when they managed to take out the Washington Capitals by a score of 4-0. So finally we get a big win here for the Sharks, and they've managed to now put themselves on a decently respectable 2-game winning streak. Compared to most of the NHL, those teams would look at a 2-game winning streak and say, well, that's essentially nothing. But for a Sharks team that really has been struggling ever since the return from the Olympic break, managing to string together 2 straight victories is still rather impressive. Now, it should be noted that both of those victories came against the exact same team, the Los Angeles Kings, and while the Kings do currently find themselves second place in the Pacific Division, this is an extremely short-handed Kings squad, playing both of these games without players like Drew Doughty, Alex Edler, Victor Arvidsson, and a few other depth pieces. And on top of that, here tonight, a couple of Kings players went down with an injury. Just to add to that list, Dustin Brown did not return to this game. Matt Roy did not return to this game. So if there was a game for the Sharks to win, if there were 2 games for the Sharks to win, it would be both of these against a Kings team that is essentially icing close to an AHL squad with Andrei Kopitar. So the Sharks, they get the victory. It's nice to see, but this isn't necessarily some sort of massive turning point for the Sharks, because I think that's an important fact to bring up, because obviously with 2 wins, the Sharks fans might start thinking that there could be a possibility of playoffs. The Sharks find themselves 8 points out, which is a pretty big margin, but not insurmountable. However, you have to add more context to this potential playoff race. The Sharks are 8 points behind the Dallas Stars, who currently hold the last wildcard space. But first of all, the Stars do have a game in hand on the San Jose Sharks, so that's one thing to note. But most importantly, the Sharks aren't just 8 points behind that Stars team, and so if they can just have a better end of the season stretch than the Stars, they'd make it in. For instance, if the Stars went 11-14 over their last 25 games and the Sharks managed to go something like 15-9 over their last 24, they would be tied. The problem is that the Sharks also have to have a better stretch than the Edmonton Oilers, who are ahead of them. They have to have a better stretch than the Jets, the Anaheim Ducks. There are a lot of teams that the Sharks are currently chasing down for a playoff spot, so they don't only have to outperform the Stars, but 4 other teams as well, which makes it just such a difficult position for the Sharks. Realistically, if they wanted to be able to make the playoffs, they'd probably have to win about 19 of their remaining 24 games, which is not impossible, but it certainly is very improbable. Moving on to this actual game to talk about it, in the first period, the Sharks have really struggled as of late during first periods, but here tonight they really just bust the gate wide open, managing to score not 1, not 2, but 3 goals in the opening frame. The first would come from Timo Meier on the power play, his 25th of the season. The Sharks would then get a rare even strength goal from their bottom 6. That would be Matt Nieto to make it 2-0 San Jose. And then in the last minute of the first period, the Sharks would get a third goal. That one would come from Jonathan Dahlen as he gets off the schneid to put the Sharks in a 3-0 lead going into the second period. Though this wasn't necessarily meaning that the Sharks dominated the first period. In fact, it was a pretty decent trade of chances between these 2 teams. The fact was that the Sharks managed to convert on their chances, and the couple of chances that the Kings had, Aiden Hill was managing to make the saves on. If you actually didn't watch the scoreboard and just watched how this game ended up, or this first period ended up going, you'd say it was rather even, but the Sharks had the killer instinct here tonight. In the second period, it was kind of more of the same. While the Sharks didn't manage to score 3 goals like they did in the first, they did manage to add another one anyway. That would be Tomas Hertl also on the power play to make it 4-0 San Jose, and that would be the score at the end of the second period. In the third, the Kings would come out immediately with a great chance on net, but after that one would be saved and prevented, the Kings just didn't really have much in there, and the third period kind of went rather well for the Sharks. They weren't absolutely dominating and getting tons of great chances for themselves, but neither were really the Kings, and the Sharks would eventually add a 5th goal coming from Tomas Hertl, his 2nd of the game and his 25th of the season, and that would be the final score. On to the players to talk about. We have the Sharks' first line, Meyer, Couture, and Dahlin. A fantastic game for them, and you could just tell it was going to be a great game for themselves just by their first couple of shifts of this one. They were immediately dominant in the King zone, which was definitely nice to see. Meyer is one of the many players for the San Jose Sharks who have really struggled since the return of the Olympic break, or return from the Olympic break, and so it's nice to see him begin to really pick up the pace here. He scores 3 points here tonight, a goal and 2 assists. He ends up as the first star of the game, if that matters to some people, and so it was a nice performance from him. Another player on his line important to talk about would be Jonathan Dahlin. Like I said, got off the schneid here with that goal, and I saw a lot of people trying to give some credit to Bob Brunner, and maybe there does deserve to be some credit, but I do think we do have to temper the expectations there of Bob Brunner being some sort of guru when it comes to the young players, because if we actually take a look at exactly the journey Dahlin took to this point over these past few games, it doesn't necessarily shine that great of a light on Brunner, because he was demoted down to the fourth line for a couple of games and then ended up as a healthy scratch. Once he returned to the lineup for the following game, if he had immediately responded and had a good game on that first line, I would have said, you know what, maybe Bob Brunner does know what he's talking about, but that's not exactly what happened. He played the first period of that game on the first line and then was demoted back to the fourth line. Then in the game after that, still stayed in the bottom six for the San Jose Sharks, and it was only in that game when he would get injured where Dahlin would then keep himself out for 2 weeks. He would return for this past game against the Kings, and here tonight, Dahlin would look much better thanks to that, but it's hard to really trace that back because of the fact that he was healthy scratched a few weeks ago as a reason why Dahlin has suddenly turned things around. Maybe the injury just actually did him some good to clear his mind with those 2 weeks off. That could definitely be something, but I just don't think a ton of credit needs to go with Bob Brunner, especially with some of the other mishandlings he has had this season. It's possible that a broken clock is right twice a day, or at least once a day in Bob Brunner's case, but I wouldn't go that far just yet. When it comes to the Sharks' second line, it was also extremely effective for them here tonight. Balcers was a bit more of a complimentary piece, I would say, for the San Jose Sharks. He wasn't amazing, though he certainly did his part. But the two players who I do definitely want to talk about would be both Tomas Hertl and Barabanov. To start off first with Hertl, he had struggled as of late prior to these 2 games against the Los Angeles Kings. I believe he went 5 straight without a point, but he is beginning to pick it up once again. Had the overtime game winner last game, has a couple of goals here tonight, and that is definitely nice to see, and especially good for himself. Tomas Hertl going down the stretch. We have about a week to go until the trade deadline, and obviously Hertl's name has been talked about a lot as an impending unrestricted free agent, though it seems as though that the Sharks aren't actually going to trade Hertl and are hoping to make some sort of extension work. I don't necessarily agree with that, but if you are going to try and go for the extension route, you better make for damn sure that you're actually going to get an extension out of him. And right now, with the way that Hertl has played over these past couple of games, he's certainly driving the price upwards. When it comes to his line mate Barabanov, interesting story with him. He was picked up at the trade deadline last season in a pretty innocuous trade between the Sharks and the Maple Leafs, which sent Antti Suomela to Toronto in exchange for Barabanov. Barabanov was then immediately inserted onto the Sharks' second line and made a strong impact right away with Kane and Hertl. He would then sign a 1-year, $1 million contract this past offseason because he really only played less than a dozen games in the past season, and he has performed very well. So Barabanov is a name who has also been involved in the trade talks as a pending unrestricted free agent, though I don't think that the Sharks should actually trade him. I think they should try and go for the extension with Barabanov, mostly because it's not going to end up as an 8-year, $8 million deal like Hertl would end up being. It would probably end up being in the 4 years, maybe 5 years, at a pretty reasonable amount of cash, and Barabanov has just fit in so well into the Sharks' top 6 that it's hard to really argue against keeping him, and he's still relatively young, 1 year younger than Hertl at the age of 27 at the moment. When it comes to the Sharks' bottom 6 for the rest of the game, it didn't necessarily go super well, but it also didn't necessarily go super poorly. Like I said, the Sharks' third line did score a goal here tonight, but most of the time, both of these two lines found themselves in the defensive zone a lot. The good news would be that in the defensive zone, they weren't giving up a ton of great chances. They were just giving up a lot of shot attempts. And so that's like a slight positive, I guess. But right now, it was essentially a situation here tonight where the first two lines for the Sharks were just so good that the bottom six didn't really have to do much of anything. And honestly, for a lot of the Sharks' victories thus far this season, the big victories, I should say, like the 5-0s, the 4-0s, the 5-1s, things like that, it really has been a case of the Sharks' top six dominating and the bottom six kind of struggling a bit behind. That's really just been an issue for the San Jose Sharks the entirety of this season, which is sad because it was a specific target for Doug Wilson this past offseason to try and improve the bottom six, and there really hasn't been that much of an improvement. When it comes to the defensemen, I should note a very nice bounce-back game from the duo of Burns and Middleton. They did not look particularly good in the previous one against the Los Angeles Kings, but here tonight they were certainly more noticeable by being less noticeable in a way. It kind of sounds a bit awkward to say because of that, but basically you notice when Brent Burns makes a mistake because he makes a lot of them and they're usually rather glaring. And while there were a couple here tonight, there's definitely one in particular that I'm thinking about in my mind at this point. There were a lot less than there were in the previous games, which is nice to see. It's sad that that's kind of the marker that we're using for Brent Burns. How many terrible mistakes does he make per game? And if it's a low number, then he actually did well. But that's, I guess, the case that we're coming to now. A decent and solid game for the Sharks' first pairing. When it comes to Erik Karlsson, he had returned from injury in the previous one against the Los Angeles Kings and immediately made an impact. He was probably the Sharks' best player last game, but here tonight, it was definitely a step back for the Sharks defenseman. He did have a couple of very nice passes that could have resulted for a chance if the players receiving those passes actually received them. But otherwise, I didn't think Karlsson had nearly the impact that he had in the previous game. He was okay on the power play, which allowed the Sharks to get that early power play goal, but otherwise there wasn't a ton doing at even strength for himself. When it comes to the third pairing, I would say Vlasic Miloš. Honestly, there really isn't much to say. I was hoping that Ryan Merkley could make his way back into the lineup at some point so the Sharks could run that Burns, Karlsson, and Merkley, and so that Merkley could actually get the second power play time so that Jacob Middleton wouldn't randomly get power play time. But at this point, Merkley has been sent down to the Barracuda. It seems as though we are stuck with Vlasic and Miloš and potentially a Shemek as a seventh defenseman, so we make do with it as we must. And finally, there is the Sharks goaltender. Sawchenko certainly did an admirable job filling in for the Sharks goaltending over these past couple of games, but still it is nice to see one of the two main goaltenders for the Sharks actually return to the lineup. You know, like I said, Sawchenko did well, but you take a look at those first couple of goals that he let in the previous game against the Los Angeles Kings, and you're a bit happy that Adin Hill has returned. Not as though that Adin Hill has been a world beater here this season, but he certainly did look better before he went down with the injury a few weeks ago. And he comes immediately here tonight against the Los Angeles Kings and puts up a very strong performance. Obviously, it's a shutout, his second one of the season, and while he didn't have to stand on his head and steal this game away, he did still have to make a few very key saves. There was one early in the first period where he made a save on a 3-on-1, and who knows, maybe if the Kings scored there, this game looks completely different. But because Adin Hill managed to shut the door, the Sharks get this strong win, and any slight glimmers of hope that the Sharks have for a potential playoff spot, which even though that is a complete long shot, it's still technically possible. That hope is kept alive by a nice performance here from Hill. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Tuesday, where they will take on the Florida Panthers. It will be another reunion with Joe Thornton, but unlike the previous matchup, which was in Florida, this is going to be Joe Thornton's first time returning to San Jose in a non-San Jose Sharks jersey in an extremely long time. So definitely going to be a heartfelt night. The last time the Sharks played against the Panthers, it was a very entertaining game, even though the Sharks did lose and did get pretty severely outplayed. So I expect a lot of open ice, and we'll see if we have a good game and potentially a third straight win. Class dismissed.